So we'll give everyone a few more minutes because we're certainly expecting quite a number of people to come along and join us. We've got many who, writing on gender and sexuality, and certainly I think Douglas gave us a really excellent, I suppose he's spoken about Ulrichs a little bit from his own work in his thesis. So I mean, I must admit I was completely unfamiliar with Ulrichs. It's well outside my area, but even still I felt somewhat shamefaced at the name just until perhaps a couple of years ago. I mean,
I don't think he's well known. He's not well known at all. In fact, I think my book on him outside of the homosexual community, homosexual rights community, and so on was very, very. He wasn't known outside of that community.
No. Well, that makes I appreciate that. Look, that makes me feel better, Ralph. But it's even still, it seems like a bit of a. Well, I suppose everyone knows. I know craft ebbing. And that's kind of
Sure.
As far as I ever got. But I enjoyed you had a very interesting interview where they asked you about the work, and I thought that point about I suppose the idea of a oppositional or dissident sort of assertion of rights, as opposed to sort of the I guess the Phil Hellenism type mode.
Right.
Really, that was fascinating.
I think it's different to try to establish, minority rights in a context where they're opposed, as opposed to celebrating them in a context where they're pretty much dominant.
Yeah. I think that was a perfectly crafted paragraph to anybody who ever sort of asks about, I guess, antiquity. It's like, if I can quote that, I certainly will. It was beautifully distilled and excellent. So I think we're getting a few more along. You also raised some of the figures there, and it reminded me of a work we read in literature by yours, Karl Ulrichs, Against the Grain, where it was sort of a kind of a self-conscious embrace of being kind of, against nature, I think, which was very, I think, quite different to some of the modes of thought that are being spoken, discussed here, where it is presented as very much part of sort of human variety and heterogeneity. But it seemed like it was another mode of expressing kind of sexual dissidence in that period. But it's sort of more Britain in 1890s, I think.
Right.
Yeah, and probably less political. I was just amazed. This guy stands up, in front of jurists. No one, even by 48, Universal Declaration, sort of the era that I'm familiar with, there's definitely no flat out assertions of, it's not really even particularly strong coded assertions of gay rights.
Right.
So it seems incredibly modern, and yeah,
He is. Yeah. He's unusual for the period. He really is. That's what makes it fun, because then you can contrast him with the dominant culture of the era and really see some interesting things, I think.
Oh, absolutely. And who knew that Prussia in this period was such a hotbed of progressive thought, but, sorry, that's I was born in France. I can't help it. What am I meant to do?
Oh, buddy.
I any discussion of 1870 is still fresh. I guess is probably what. Yeah, let it go. So I'll just ask my head of program, Kat, whether we should we give folks a minute or two more, or what do you?
I think we could probably get started. It's 12:35.
Yeah, excellent.
We may as well just go, otherwise we'll lose time for questions at the end.
We will. I think that's, and I suspect we'll have many of them. So I'm standing in today just for Claudia. And before I introduce our guest, I do want to acknowledge the lands on which I'm zooming in from, the Wurundjeri Wurrung and Bunurong people and their special relationship to the land. And in particular, that living connection to country and the relationship with the land and all living things extending back tens of thousands of years. And you may wish to add that acknowledgement in the chat. So we've got Ralph speaking with us today on a fascinating topic of Karl Ulrichs. And I learned a number of terms, even studying the introduction to the work and some of its surrounding materials. Firstly, sexual modernist, which, you know, made me think of different models of you know, iPhone and so forth. Like there's an iterative process of, but then I realized I was completely, that was not it at all on further reading. And also a variety of, I think, really fascinating ways of thinking about assertions of rights in this arena. And you know, what struck me most of all was just how much of a pioneer Ulrichs was. So you know, I think compared to the very timid kind of ideas about toleration and decriminalization, seeing some of these ideas so boldly stated in 1860s Prussia was truly fascinating. So very much looking forward to it. And did you want to share screen with us at all there, Ralph, or you just speak to?
I have a PowerPoint presentation.
Excellent. So I think, yes, just share your screen with us and we should be good to go.
Okay.
I'm intimidated by your bookshelf now, Ralph. It's really impressive. Very, very good. So yes, I think we're ready to go whenever the slides come up. Ah, huzzah!
All right. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Are we all good, team?
Yeah, I'm going to go this way.
Excellent.
Okay, are we ready to get started? I wanted to thank Professor Claudia Haka, who unfortunately can't be here, and also Dr. Douglas Pretzel, who recommended that I speak at La Trobe, and I want to thank all of you for hosting me. We here sit on the We of People's land, the Miami Indian land in Indiana, and we recognize their traditions. I got interested in Karl Ulrichs some time ago through a person by the name of Magnus Hirschfeld, and he was an anti-fascist, and I was interested in anti-fascism at the time, and I found myself studying Karl Ulrichs. How do we advance this? Ulrichs was a lawyer in Hanover. And Hanover, when he was born, was an independent state. He became a lawyer, a jurist, came from a bourgeois family. His mother's family worked for the church. His father's family worked for the monarchy. And what happened was that Prussia invaded Hanover in 1866. And he opposed that invasion because it meant the laws criminalizing homosexuality that were in place in Prussia would now be in place in Hanover, where homosexuality had been decriminalized. The police went and searched his house. They confiscated his research on sexual diversity, volumes and volumes of it. And now he had been writing under a pseudonym by the name of Numa Numanius, and no more was he going to be writing under a pseudonym because it was now public knowledge that he was in fact the author of these early publications on sexual science, books that would run to about 12 books and would later be published in 1899 in this volume that you see printed here. Ulrichs was a special kind of intellectual, a public or engaged intellectual, and he believed that there was a connection between learning and the natural sciences, the history, and all other areas of the humanities and civic responsibility. In his letters, his coming out letters as early as 1862, he talked about sexual diversity, and those letters made their way into Magnus Hirschfeld's work on sexual intermediaries by the 1890s, and eventually the epistolary record of sexual science, the role of letters and autobiographies that we see so important that I've written about in my work, epistolary sexual science. Hirschfeld, of course, Ulrich, plays a role in that as well. He called for the decriminalization and the humanization of sexual minorities, and his courage was really unparalleled. He went before the Congress of German Lawyers. It's a national organization. He himself, of course, was a lawyer, and as early as 1867 asked them to end criminalization of homosexuality. He dedicated his life to the scientific, legal, and moral defense of sexual minorities. I wanted to say something about language because much of the work that I've done on Ulrichs is on language and his relationship to dominant languages of the era. So first of all, I want to talk about religious languages as they relate to sexuality, particularly Christianity, given its dominance in Western Europe in this time. Nature is a power language. We often talk in Western societies about natural rights and natural laws. Nature is a very, very important concept organizing society. Things that are said to be natural are often said to be godly. They're equated with godliness, and that which is unnatural is said to be ungodly. So you can imagine when these terms are directed at the sexual life and sexual diversity, we see that the eternity, the idea of eternal truth and universal truth associated with God is now organizing. Prior to the French Revolution was the major way in which law and marriage and morality was understood. So Christianity at the time, prior to say 1789 and the 19th century, naturalized obligatory heterosexuality and naturalized the hierarchy of patriarchy and women's second-class status. Both religion and law at this time in most European countries followed lines of argumentation around what was natural. Homosexuality was said to be unnatural, and therefore it became illegal. I mention this because, as you'll see as we move on in this lecture, one of the biggest changes, one of the revolutionary changes that was initiated by Ulrichs was the rejection of religious language of naturalness as legitimate scientifically. Both traditional natural science and religion tended to construct and legitimate social inequalities around sexuality, hierarchies of heterosexism, hierarchies of patriarchy. This led, of course, not only to a patriarchal society, but the persecution of sexual minorities. And the way that I see, and this isn't just me, other scholars have talked about early sexual science as the medicalization of sin. Yes, they provided scientific husks for their claims about the unnaturalness of homosexuality, but really inside of it all were religious kernels. They had not deviated from the dominant assumptions of the era. I want to make one quick reference to this sign down here on the bottom. I don't like the language here, but this person frequently comes to my town. My partner and I have protested him coming. This is a very common relationship between heterosexism and religion that's prominent in the United States. Psychopathia sexualis is the term that I use to describe the group of scholars who participate in stigmatizing homosexuality and harmless, what we now know as largely harmless activities like masturbation. So I want to say something about that. The word psychopathia sexualis came from two scholars. One was Heinrich Kahn from the early first half of the 19th century and his work. And the other one was Krafft Ebing, who became the most important Central European sexologist by around the 1890s. Prior to the coming of Ulrichs, almost all sexual differences that deviated from heterosexuality fell under language that was very stigmatizing and for us very problematic. You can see in Psychopathia Sexualis, the title of both the book by Heinrich Kahn and later a book by Richard Krafft Ebing. Both of them include a kind of idea of psychological problems. They're pathological. These words connote some kind of wayward difference associated with people who are not heterosexual. Degeneration, I write a whole chapter on that in my book, sometimes using the language of Entautung or Ausautung in the German, but this was a major language of the historical period, and usually sexual differences were coded in this language, and as I mentioned already, the language of unnaturalness, the language of evil. I'll mention, I've listed here several case studies, examples. These are examples of sexual science from the 19th century that really truck in and analyze sexual diversity from this stigmatizing framework of language. As I mentioned, Heinrich Kahn's work of 1844 was largely concerned with a sensorial relationship to masturbation. The whole idea of psychopathia sexualis then, beginning with Kahn, was one of surveillance and should be understood in a Foucaultian framework. If you look at Morel in the case of France, you can see the traits of degenerate physical, intellectual, and moral cases of human nature. And the relationship between the social scientist Morel, most of these people were medical doctors, by the way, unlike Ulrichs. Morel, however, was also a leader of the New Catholic movement, so the relationship between conservative Christianity and sexual science is very clear in his case. Reich wrote a number of works. He too, like Heinrich Kahn, was mostly concerned with masturbation and the need for domestic surveillance to make sure that this kind of perversion, this kind of degeneration doesn't take over our children. Perhaps the most well-known cultural document of the late 19th century using the concept of degeneration was from Max Nordau. This is a massive book, and Nordau, who was a medical doctor, transfers the language of degeneration from the sexual sciences and the medical fields to the realm of art and the humanities. He's very much an anti-feminist, an anti-socialist, anti-modernist, very much opposed to things like naturalist ideas about women's equality that arose in the arts at the time. Finally, I want to mention Albert Moll, a very, very important sexual scientist, and his concept of the contrary sexual feeling. heterosexuality was seen as being the only normal sexuality. Non-heterosexuality feelings were said to be contrary to nature. Here again, we see the language that's so important for stigmatizing, and we're going to move on. Ulrichs initiated a massive revolution in how we conceive of what is natural in human sexuality. And I call this an epistemic revolution, using the term episteme to signify a field of knowledge. And the field of knowledge I'm talking about now is the field of sexual science. Prior to the coming of Ulrichs, the question of what is natural with regard to sexuality was always answered with a very simple heterosexuality is natural. And that's the conception of religion that was dominant in Europe well into the 19th century. Natural science has a very different standard for what is natural than what is the standard for naturalness of religion. Empirically, if something exists in nature, science says it's natural. It doesn't matter how rare it is. It doesn't matter how often it's found. But if it exists, it is said to be natural. Well, following that logic, Ulrichs said and recognized empirically that sexual diversity and sexual variety, hermaphrodites and very, very large number of sexually non-heterosexual types that are discussed, they exist in the world, and therefore they meet the standard of scientific naturalness. And we begin to see here the challenges of the Enlightenment as they relate to the sciences and especially to religion. Religious fundamentalism is today one of the strongest forces in favor of sexual patriarchy, as well as stigmatizing sexual minorities. And this goes against the scientific presuppositions of and the empirical evidence to the contrary. What Ulrichs began was a classificatory revolution. It used to be the case, as I showed you on the previous page, that sexual minorities were classified using stigmatizing, demeaning language. And Ulrichs invented, this was his genius. He knew that in order for people who were not part of the majority, they needed to be identified. They needed to have a way to describe themselves to others, and for a scientific language to exist to describe them that wasn't inherently calling them buggers or calling them words which refer to unsavory behavior, apparently, or stigmatizing conceptions. So note here that the word that Ulrichs developed for same-sex love, yearning for men, yearning jinn for women, the word developed for male-female love, dioning and dioning jinn, notice that I did not use the word heterosexual and homosexual. The reason I don't write them here is because when language was invented, this language was invented by Ulrichs, those words did not exist. The words homosexual and heterosexual were actually invented by someone who was a colleague of Ulrichs. He was very inspired by Ulrichs. He wrote pieces on politics calling for homosexual equality. And the words homosexual and heterosexual were invented by him. And we use them today as a result, often not knowing what the origins of them are. One of the most interesting arguments for Ulrichs is coming out of a subfield of science, the science of embryology. Ulrichs was very much taken with the science of embryology because he believed that it was the best way to explain human sexual diversity. And he came to believe that all humans are embryological intermediaries. That is, they are intermediaries between the ovum and the sperm And because the ovum is neutral, or we might even say protean or heterogeneous in its sexual character, we should expect humanity to endlessly produce sexual diversity. Because the first nature of humanity is that we are, in fact, intermediaries born of embryological, biological transformation. The importance of this clearly is that Ulrichs has established a conception of human sexuality which is non-binary. It is a non-binary archetype of what humans are. And this, under the language today, we often talk about being gender fluid, gender queer, non-binary. And for Ulrichs, all of this can be understood from the perspective of our chromosomal essence, our embryological intermediary status. So just as the conception of nature was rejected by Ulrichs science, rejected the tradition of nature as defined by religion, so too Ulrichs' revolutionary thinking rejected the idea that human beings are male or female and said that this dichotomy itself was totally unscientific. Now, I want to say something about the concept of epistemic virtue. Comes from Elaine Daston's work. I deal with it in my work. And it just means, it's a really interesting idea, an episteme being a subfield of knowledge and virtue referring to its civic consequences. We're often unaware that certain subfields of science have consequences for politics and civic life that maybe most people who are working in this area may not even have known existed. One example of that I've already mentioned, and that is that the study of embryology became a field which became very important to people who were pushing as activists for the change to decriminalize homosexuality. Why? Because obviously this changed the idea that difference was somehow unnatural. Difference is very natural according to this idea. Now, I want to contrast the epistemic consequences as a civic knowledge of the concept of the idea of embryology to hormonal study, the study of endocrinology, because if you look at endocrinology, it almost always starts from the premise that there are male and female hormones. Excuse me. And so it is a science which almost always pops up when people are trying to justify very rigid conceptions of human sexuality in terms of male and female. Another consequence of this idea of embryology, as I mentioned, humanity is a hermaphroditic essence. We all are of hermaphroditic origins, and the civic implications of this are very clear that sexual diversity is natural. By this point, Ulrichs, both empirically, by looking at sexual difference, and by understanding embryology, was able to give a scientific explanation for human diversity. And this had huge civic implications for him. No longer would he accept people saying that homosexuals or that hermaphrodites or that other people who were sexual minorities were unnatural. He would not permit that language. And this marked him as a revolutionary sexual scientist of his era. He was one of the only people saying, without any stigma, without any moral encasement, that human sexuality was characterized by variety. And he even went so far as to say, it's a scientific absurdity to even claim the existence of an unnatural sexuality, because any sexuality that appears in nature is natural. This moved sexual science. This moved the study of sexology from a binary field of male-female understanding to a field that was ontologically committed, foundationally committed to a recognition of variety as natural. And let's admit that hermaphrodites and those with ambiguous genitalia, it's very easy to say, oh, well, you're just making up your difference because you are what some people would call a psychological hermaphrodite. You're not pure male or female. But in fact, this was not just a psychological condition, it was an empirical condition. We have existing evidence, vast evidence for non-binary sexuality. And as a result, we should stop using language that doesn't recognize variety as foundational, because we're allowing a binary conception of heterosexism, we're allowing a binary conception of heterosexism to dominate science, religion, and society in the 19th century, and that continues well into the 20th and 21st century in many areas. Concerning Ulrichs' hidden modern influence, how many of us know that when we use the word homosexual and heterosexual, those words came from a political movement, a movement driven by modern values of equality and inclusion, a discourse which tried to free people who were different from the stigma of language, which was multiple in its forms, multiple languages for putting people in their place. And instead of that classificatory prejudice and stigma, what you have is an embrace of diversity, a devotion to science, and a devotion to inclusive equality. One of Ulrichs' biggest claims, biggest assertions, and this is a chapter I wrote on the science of agape, is that we all have a right to love. And denying people the right to marry who are homosexual, denying people who are hermaphrodites the right to choose to keep their genitalia or to have surgery, etc. These kinds of choices about questions of love and how love takes place sexually should be left to people and not controlled by this binary need to turn hermaphrodites into male or females, or to deny people the right to love. Ulrichs and Kurt Benny were both heavily influenced by the 1848 revolution in Europe. This was a revolution which continued many of the themes of the French Revolution, themes found in the 1830, 1832 revolution of workers and individual expansion of voting rights. In the case of Ulrichs and his push for the right to love and equality that would come with the right to marry, very clear that he's a scholar who, once he's discovered this scientific knowledge, he wants to have it be known to the public and facilitate thereby social change. He wants people to know homosexuality is natural and absolutely moral. And in the case of Kurt Benny's essays in the 1870s, he's calling for the decriminalization of homosexuality as well. And ultimately, what these individuals call to the fore is the question of whether or not we can recognize as legitimate sexual varieties, or whether we're going to continue to condemn them, whether we're going to live in a society governed by religious heterosexism, where differences are coded as evil or unnatural or perverted. And let me say very quickly, when we're thinking about this, that suicide played a very, very vital role in the history of sexual science. And we found that people who were other, people who were different, often committed suicide. That was a letter sent to Hirschfeld, happened to be a letter of suicide, talking about a suicide from one of his patients. And that was very important for understanding that's a suppression of the rights to love, the suppression of the rights to identify as one wishes in terms of sexual identity, had real consequences, life-changing consequences for people. Suicides were common because of social shame coming from the stigma of homosexuality. I think we need to move beyond tolerance, is what is suggested by Ulrichs, and embrace something that's inclusive, an inclusive vision of equality. And what we see with Ulrichs is a contribution to a transformation in the law. Prior to the coming of the French Revolution and people like Ulrichs, the law was governed by religion and morality, moral conceptions of Christianity. After Ulrichs, the law was no longer controlled by conceptions of traditional Christian morality. It was controlled by conceptions of harm and consent. If two people are consenting adults, if there's no harm, then there's no legal case for the state to intervene. And so this became very important for understanding. This becomes important because it's a central feature of Ulrichs' contribution to modern changes in the law. One last reference to Ulrichs that's more contemporary, if you might. In Berlin, there is a street formerly known as Einem Street. And Einem was a Prussian minister of war. He purged homosexuals from the German military prior to World War I. He became a staunch supporter of Hitler, and he was honored when he died in 1934 with a street in the center of Berlin. Well, in 2013, activists in the paper that were defined as homosexual and lesbian activists came before two boards, two city councils of Berlin, and asked them if they would change the name of Einem Street to Karl Ulrichs Street. Here we see Ulrichs resurrected in modern society, and resurrected as a politics of memory. Nazi sexuality, you should remember, was against the egalitarian premises of feminism, opposed equality for women, homosexuals, and workers. There was broad Christian support for the Nazis and Nazi ideals, both among Catholics and among Protestants, particularly Lutherans. And in evidence of that is perhaps it took all of 6 months for the Pope in the Rome to announce that Hitler was the man on earth who represented God and the future of humanity, when the signing of the Papal Concordat in 1933, essentially giving carte blanche to Hitler from one of the most honored religious organizations in the world. This, of course, led to people being gassed, homosexuals being gassed. Right now, what happened, very interestingly for me as a historian, because I like history, like the layers of history, the street was changed by one city council, but the other city council did not change it. So there are now two streets, one Einem Street, and when it stops and becomes Karl Ulrichs Street, you can see here that Einem Street is crossed out. And this is an example of the living memory of Ulrichs. In Berlin now, when there are homosexual rights parades, they always come now to the Karl Ulrichs Strasse here to celebrate the legacy of Ulrichs and his political civic meaning. And just one last picture. I kind of like this idea that you don't remove Einem Strasse, you retain the memory of the historical figure over who Karl Heinrich Ulrichs replaced in the center of Berlin and in the center of European history. Thank you.